Good afternoon. I'm Chuck Sherman, class of 1966, and proud to be a classmate of Ken Sharp. 48 years ago, when the class of 1966 graduated, each senior received a book, A History of Dartmouth, from the class of 1916. The graduates of 67 received a gift from the class of 1917. And this gesture has morphed into the Class Connections program. Nowadays, the 50-year paired classes promote a number of different activities throughout 4 years along the road of our Dartmouth lives, leading to the bump in the road that the 16s will call graduation, and we will call our 50-year reunion. We've shared times together during the freshman trips, homecoming, carnival, and more. Today's program is the latest joint activity. Our classes are co-sponsoring this talk with the Dartmouth Institute for the study of applied and professional ethics. The Institute also supports an academic minor, the Dartmouth Ethics Society, a competitive ethics bowl, campus mediation support, and other things. I'd like to thank Anya Donovan and Diane Belbat of the Ethics Institute for helping plan for today. Ken Sharp, a member of the class of 66. Ken was a chem major, okay? Who became a professor of political science. The link there evades me, but maybe you'll fill us in. At Swarthmore. He's also been a visiting scholar at other institutions, including his alma mater, in the and here in the Government Department, and also has taught in the MALS program, the Master of Arts in Liberal Studies. Ken has published his ideas and research on drug war, politics, and transnational corporations, and his favorite article is on the cause of Iran-gate. Ken's recent book with co-author Barry Schwartz, which I happen to have a copy of here, entitled Practical Wisdom, The Right Way to Do the Right Thing, demonstrated to me that there is yet another way the 66s can contribute to the 16s. So with that, Ken, I'd like to go. Another 66. Quite a few of us here.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Can you hear me okay in the back? Is it my voice or the microphone you're hearing? My voice. My voice. But it carries? No?
Almost.
Okay. Microphone levels. How's that? Does that make any difference?
It's good.
That's good? Does that make a difference? Not too loud? Not too soft? Just right? Well, I'm here this afternoon because, for a number of reasons, but one, because Anya Donovan was kind enough to offer me a position as a visiting scholar here at the Ethics Institute, and because people like John Carey and Christine Gex and my colleagues in the Government Department have long given me a summer home here for my research projects and occasional teaching, because Chuck Sherman of the class of 66 persisted in searching me out and dragooned me into giving this talk, because the leadership of the class of 2016 were naive enough to believe Chuck when he told them that I might have something interesting to say to them, because the Templeton Foundation was kind enough to support my sabbatical this year so I could do research here at the med school and the hospital, and because of the incredible work that Diane Belbach and the Ethics Institute did to organize and promote this talk. Let me start with a story about Michael. When Michael was in his early 20s, he held up a taxi cab while brandishing a gun. He took $50. Michael was caught and he was tried in a Philadelphia court. He was a typical offender, said his judge, Lois Forer, young, black, male, a high school dropout without a job. There was no doubt that Michael was guilty. Forer pointed out that knowing this guilt, she needed to mete out punishment. So she turned to the state's sentencing guidelines. A recent law mandated a 5-year minimum for an armed robbery on public transportation. The law seemed very clear until Forer looked at the particular circumstances. Michael, it turns out, wasn't so typical. Yes, he had dropped out of high school, but he'd married his pregnant girlfriend, obtained a high school equivalency diploma, he'd been steadily employed, and he and his wife had sacrificed to send their daughter to parochial school. Shortly before the holdup, Michael had lost his job. Despondent because he couldn't support his family, he went out on a Saturday night, had more than a few drinks, and then robbed a taxi. And one more thing, the gun was a toy gun. Judge Forer thought the 5-year sentence was disproportionate. But there was a previous statute, one that mandated a 2-year sentence, and also had a provision in it that allowed judges to deviate from the minimum if there was a good reason. So Judge Forer made an exception. She sentenced Michael to 11 months in the county jail and 2 years probation and payment of the $50, repayment of the $50 he stole. She permitted him to work outside the prison during the day to support his family. She wrote, "This was his first offense. No one was harmed. Michael acted under the pressures of unemployment and need. A year-long sentence," she said, "was adequate to convince Michael of the seriousness of his crime." So how did Judge Forer make her decision? The first thing to notice is how important rules were in making her decision. There were the laws of criminal justice. Robbery is illegal. There were the procedural rules in the courtroom about who could speak. There were the sentencing rules and guidelines. But the second thing to notice is that the rules and laws were not enough. That's exactly why we need judges. Judge Forer needed to know how to balance competing but legitimate aims. For example, it was right that Michael be punished for the crime. It was also right that Michael or that the community be protected from the kind of danger that Michael might pose. But it was also right that Michael be rehabilitated so he wouldn't commit another offense upon release. And it was important that Michael's sentence do minimal harm to his wife and children and his chances of being reintegrated into the community. So the third thing to notice is that Judge Forer needed practical wisdom to interpret the rules in particular circumstances, to make exceptions, to balance competing justified claims. That's what good judges do all the time. They exercise good judgment, practical wisdom. And Forer was a good judge. She got it right for Michael. 2 years later, Michael had fully completed his imprisonment and probation. He'd paid restitution. He'd returned to his family. He'd obtained steady employment. He had not been rearrested. When Aristotle first wrote about practical wisdom, he was challenging his teacher Plato, who emphasized the importance of seeking theoretical wisdom. What is knowledge? What is beauty? What is harmony? What is the good? Aristotle worried about how you educate people to practice being good friends more than the theory of being good friends, of how to practice being good soldiers, being good doctors, being good citizens, being good legislators and statesmen. Teaching people, said Aristotle, to follow the rules was not enough. They needed to learn to apply and bend the rules. They needed to learn how to make exceptions. To do that, he said, you needed to have the moral skill to discern the particular context, and you need to have good character, the moral will to do the right thing. They need, Aristotle said, certain excellences. Today we call them strengths or virtues, like being courageous and self-controlled and just and loyal and patient, and if you add in the Christian virtues, humble, kind, and caring. And the master excellence, Aristotle argued, was what he called phronesis, which is what we today translate as practical wisdom. It was the capacity to choose wisely in a particular context. So the world today is very different than Aristotle's world, right? There's no city-states, there's nation-states. Women are treated as equal. Slavery is abhorred. But the practical wisdom that Aristotle sought to nurture remains critical, and not just for judges. Parents, as many of you know, need practical wisdom. We know the right thing to do is protect our kids from harm. We also know that if we never let them bruise a knee, fall off a bike, fail in their studies, they'll never learn the grit or courage to recover from the failure and try again. It takes wisdom to know when to protect them and when to let them fall. Friends need practical wisdom. That's because good friends always need to be honest. Good friends also always need to be kind. These are good rules. So, you go to pick up your friend, to take her to a party, you knock on the door, she opens the door, dressed to the nines, and she says to you, "How do I look?" And you don't think she looks so good. Honest, kind. Doctors need practical wisdom. How honest should you be with this patient at this time? Does honesty mean telling this patient everything? And how do you tell them? There's actually a great op-ed in Sunday's Times about this by Dr. Jahor about when should doctors lie. Even military officers need practical wisdom. It was April 2002 and the United States invasion of Iraq had just begun. Lieutenant Chris Hughes is on a delicate mission to the religious capital, Najaf. He has been tasked to contact the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, the most important Shiite cleric in Iraq. He's with a small unit. He's walking along the streets of Najaf. Crowds suddenly pour out of the buildings. They are shouting, they're screaming, they're outraged, they're waving their fists. And there's Hughes, kind of impassive in his kind of aviator sunglasses. He takes his rifle and he holds it over his head and he turns it upside down and he tells his men, "Take a knee." And the whole unit gets down on their knees and takes their rifles and points the barrels toward the ground. The Iraqis in the crowd fall silent. In a couple of minutes, he orders his men to withdraw. So how does Hughes know what to do? Had he been taught that technique? Well, when reporters interviewed him, he said no, never. He'd been taught crowd control using the backwash of helicopters, using tear gas, shooting in the air, never this technique. But what he told the reporter was the Iraqis already felt Americans were disrespecting them. The obvious solution was a gesture of respect. But what made that solution obvious? Think about what Hughes had to do. He had to read the context. What was the crowd thinking? He had to quickly imagine what the consequences were of any step he would take. He had to balance competing goals: protect his men, not harm civilians, contact al-Sistani. No rules to follow, no time to contact his superiors, no app on his iPhone. He had to improvise, and he had to do it quickly. So if practical wisdom is important for all of us, how is it learned and how is it undermined? Research in psychology and neuroscience, case studies in professional education and other areas tell us a lot. Here's one thing we know. We know that good judgment is learned through trial and error. That means people need enough discretion, enough freedom of choice to make mistakes. And that means that institutions that rely too heavily on rules and strict procedures to enforce good behavior can destroy the judgment of practitioners. Take Colonel Hughes, for example. The military needs officers like Colonel Hughes, but much of military training is not about discretion and judgment. It's about discipline, following orders. When I ask you, private, to jump, your only question is, how high? Army Chief of Staff General Shinseki in 2002 wanted to know how officers like Colonel Hughes learned to exercise such good judgment, such improvisation under pressure. So he sent in Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Wang to find out. And Wang's study is really interesting. Wang concluded that the best teacher is war, the experience of being in war. But, Wang said, before going to war, there's another way, and you want to follow that way because you don't want to wait for war for the officers to learn. Wang found out that officers learn improvisation by figuring out how to train their units, how to teach their units for the 6 or 8 months before they go over into combat, how to plan, how to execute, and how to assess their own teaching. Innovation, Wang explained, develops when an officer is given a minimal number of parameters, the task, the condition, the standards, and the time to create their own training. That teaches them how to operate within parameters of the commander's intent, but without constant supervision. So, said Wang, guidelines, not micromanagement. That's what teaches officers how to improvise in dangerous situations. But what Colonel Wang found was that the very way that officers had long been taught was rapidly changing at exactly the time that he was doing the study. The culprit, he said, was a set of training reforms that squeezed out discretion in favor of more top-down control. One thing he pointed out were all the new requirements that headquarters were laying on the officers, things that had to be included in the training, had to be included in the training. He referred to these as cascading requirements. He said company commanders found they had 297 days of mandatory requirements to fit into 256 available training days. Most seriously, he said, is that headquarters were starting to dictate exactly what would be trained and how. Commanders were basically told to follow a script. And the assessment function, how well the soldiers were doing, were taken out of the hands of the unit commanders and put in the hands of headquarters, kind of standardized tests. So the very experiences of learning through trial and error disappeared. Too many rules and requirements, said Wang, removes all discretion and stifles the development of flexible officers, resulting in, quote, reactive instead of proactive thought, compliance instead of creativity, adherence instead of audacity. Wang's conclusion, quote, the Army is creating cooks, leaders who are quite adept at carrying out a recipe, rather than chefs who can look at the ingredients available to them and create a meal. We see this same phenomena happening all the time in our public schools. Let's step inside a second grade classroom in Chicago and visit Christine Jabari. Ms. Jabari began her 53rd day of teaching kindergarten at Chicago's Joyce Kilmer Elementary School with a clear lesson plan. She opened a thick white binder on her desk to day 53. 26,000 other Chicago school teachers were opening similar binders on that same day. It was crammed with goals, conversation starters, and step-by-step questions, and what Ms. Jabari saw across the top of the page was script for day 53. Title, colon, reading and enjoying literature with the letter B. Text, colon, the bath. Lecture, colon, assemble students on the rug or reading area. Give students a warning about the dangers of hot water. Say, listen very quietly as I read the story. Say, think of other pictures that make the same sound as the sound that bath begins with. There followed a list of 75 instructions for teaching the bath. Now, it's probably the case that a lockstep procedure like that could actually be very useful for a novice teacher. But this wasn't just for novice teachers. This is required for all teachers, and the teachers are monitored to see if they follow the script. It's like having training wheels when you're learning how to ride a bicycle. That can be very useful. But when you weld those training wheels to the back of everybody's bicycle and nobody can ever take them off, you've got disaster in the making. like Wong's officers, such teachers are taught to mindlessly follow scripts, and that system risks squeezing the wisdom out of teachers, or just plain squeezing out the wise teachers. Even judges aren't immune. The prosecutor in Michael's toy gun case, he was upset by the discretion that Judge Forer used, so he went to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and asked that they require Judge Forer to mandate the 5-year minimum for Michael. And the court agreed. But by then, Michael was out. He had a clean record and seemed fully rehabilitated. Forer wrote, "I was faced with a legal and moral dilemma. As a judge, I had sworn to uphold the law, and I could find no legal grounds for violating an order of the Supreme Court. Yet, there was no social or criminological justification for sending Michael back to prison. Given the choice between defying a court order or my conscience, I decided to leave the bench where I had sat for 16 years. Another judge stepped in, resentenced Michael to serve another 4 years and 15 days. Faced with this prospect, Michael disappeared." If rules undermine practical wisdom, what about the other favorite alternative our society has for controlling or encouraging good behavior? Incentives. Bribes. Bribe people with external or extrinsic rewards instead of coercing them or requiring them. Any parent or corporate executive knows that incentives work, at least in the short term. But they come with a risk of corroding any internal North Star that we may have. There are a lot of psych experiments which show this effect. James Hyman and Dan Ariely, two social psychologists, took a team of students and put them on a street in a moving van. They put a couch outside the moving van. And the students stopped passersby and asked them if they would help load the couch into the moving van. And almost every passerby, if they were physically fit enough, agreed to do it, and they would load the couch into the moving van. So, the next day they went to another street corner, same students, same van, same couch. This time when passersby came, they offered the students a small payment to put the couch in the van. And this time, far fewer were willing to do it. What was first construed as a social transaction, doing a favor, was reframed as a market transaction, and the passersby started thinking about the size of the fee, not how to be helpful. No. The very incentivizing of the activity changed the moral meaning. So, that was an experimental situation, but there are real cases, like the Israeli daycare center, that was having trouble because the parents of the kids, not a lot actually, just a few parents of the kids were coming late. And that put the daycare workers in a difficult position because they couldn't go home until the parents picked up the kids. So the administrators came up with what they thought was a brilliant idea. Let's fine the tardy parents for each lateness. So, how did it work? Not so well. More parents failed to show up on time. What happened? The fine for doing wrong changed the activity into a market transaction. Being late now had a price, and if you were willing to pay the price, why not? Responsibility. So the caretakers of your kids could go home early. Consideration that they had lives also. Considerations of decency and fairness, all out the window. The incentives didn't bring out the best in parents. They demoralized their relationship with the care providers. And when the school realized its mistake 6 months later, it abandoned the fines. And what happened? Parent lateness increased yet again because now lateness was free. So here's the third thing we know. The corrosion of practical wisdom by rules and incentives is not inevitable. Institutions can be designed to encourage wisdom to be learned. Let's peek into a courtroom in Buffalo, New York for a minute. Gary Pettengill steps before Judge Russell. "Hi, Gary," said the judge. "Nice to see you. Why not give me an update?" "My family and I moved into a new home," said Mr. Pettengill. "That's good news," said the judge. "How do you like it?" "Pretty nice," said Pettengill. "Different neighborhood, pretty quiet, a lot bigger though, a lot bigger than before, more room for the kids to play inside." So, why is a judge having this conversation with a drug offender like Pettengill? That's because Judge Russell is in a special court, a veterans court. It's a court that aims to balance retribution and rehabilitation, which is what wise judges are supposed to do. Pettengill was 23 years old. He had been serving in Iraq. He had a severe back injury and had to leave the military. He was married. He had a third kid on the way, but he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and nightmares and started using marijuana to ease his symptoms. Only able to get part-time work because of his back, unable to put food on the table or buy cans of baby formula at $20 a pop, he started selling the marijuana too. And then he was busted. A New York judge in a normal court, following the normal mandatory sentencing requirements, would have had to sentence Pettengill to serious prison time as a drug felon. Pettengill's family would have been kicked out of their apartment, and the welfare system might have taken his kids away. But Pettengill was in a veterans court. It was actually the first veterans court in the United States, and it was a court that Judge Russell himself had designed. To build a new system, what Russell did was go out and got the support of local prosecutors, the Veterans Administration, social workers, probation officers, and other vets. All of them agreed non-violent offenders like Pettengill shouldn't be thrown into prison because they don't have work to support their families and get medical assistance. That would resolve nothing. They would just revolve in and out of prison for the rest of their lives. They all agreed with Russell's plan to create a court that could both punish and rehabilitate. Russell's court became a national model. By 2014, there were 135 other veterans courts like that in the country. And the 108 vets who had completed the program in Russell's court, by 2010, the number who came back through the revolving door was 0. The fourth thing we know from numerous studies of medical, law, and other professional schools is that curricula can be designed to encourage moral formation and practical wisdom. What you need to do is design a community of practice where students learn together through practicing together, where learning through mistakes is encouraged, and where there's serious guidance by mentors and coaches who can role model and counsel. So, Dr. Jerome Lowenstein is a physician at NYU Medical School. He taught a weekly seminar in humanistic medicine. He wanted the med students to learn that empathy was at the heart of good medical practice. He remembers once asking his seminar students, "Do you think that we can teach you compassion?" There was, he said, a long and uncomfortable silence. Then, a young intern, in a voice that conveyed both anger and shame, said, "I don't know if you can teach us compassion, but you surely can teach us the opposite." What the student meant, said Lowenstein, was that there was a disconnect between what Lowenstein was teaching in the seminar and what he and other doctors actually modeled on the floor of the wards. There was barely enough time to visit and care for patients, let alone teach the students shadowing them. The only focus was on the underlying pathophysiology. How patients themselves understood and responded to illness was rarely discussed. How staff cautioned med students against, quote, becoming too involved with individual patients. There's some research on this that's interesting. At Philadelphia's Jefferson Hospital, Dr. Hojat and his colleagues measured the changes in empathy among 456 students as they moved through 4 years of medical school. The researchers found a significant decline in empathy during the 3rd year, the very time when students move out of the classroom and begin to work with patients. Then there's the 2010 survey of Dartmouth medical students, right here. 93% agreed that empathy is a necessary characteristic to the practice of responsible medicine. 64% were worried about becoming cynical or less empathic. 71.5% of the final year students felt that they were more cynical than in the first year. One of the hospitals that I studied 3 years ago now, was a small community hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where a team of Harvard Medical School doctors decided on the basis of similar research to do something about this problem. Led by two doctors, Dr. Barbara Oger and Dave Hirsch, they decided to totally restructure the third year, totally. Students were, instead of assigning the students to the wards, they assigned students to work half a day, every day, with one doctor in the outpatient clinics instead of the ward. Monday internal medicine, Tuesday pediatrics, and so on. And not only one-on-one with their doctor mentor, but also one-on-one with patients. In fact, each third-year student was assigned 15 patients to work with for the whole year. To take one student, Michael Morse, he was one that I followed, not only treated these patients under his mentor's watchful eye, but any time one of those 15 patients came into the hospital, Michael's beeper would go off. And unless he was in some kind of an emergency situation, he would leave whatever he was doing. He would go find the patient, and he would accompany the patient either in the hospital or the other clinic the patient was in. Michael and his fellow students experienced what it actually meant to care for a patient. And the close working relationship with each doctor allowed them time for serious, ongoing mentoring. They were doing what's often, the euphemism is often problem-based learning, but the problems weren't textbook problems. They were actually real problems. They were the problems the medical students were actually facing. So trial and error learning was built into the program. You propose things that might be mistakes, explained Michael, and the experienced clinician catches you. If you've never had responsibility for a patient, he said, you've never had the experience of almost making a mistake, and the learning that comes from figuring out why you almost got it wrong. Here at Dartmouth Medical School, there's an active group of faculty working to integrate compassion and wisdom-inducing practices into the curriculum. For the first and second year students, for example, people like Joe O'Donnell and Peter, aka Pano, Rodis, have designed their Connecting Hearts and Minds rounds, which regularly bring in former patients, plus the patient's families, plus the patient's doctors, plus the patient's nurses, all sitting in a room a little bigger than this, sitting in front. Each talks about how they experienced this particular case, allowing the students to get inside the hearts and minds of the different experiences. Then in the on-doctoring course at the med school, students are assigned little small seminars, 8-person seminars, where they work together with a doctor preceptor, sometimes a retired doctor, for 2 years. Same group of students, same doctor. They go to a doctor's office, not the preceptor's office, but another doctor's office every other week. They learn how to do physical exams. They learn how to reflect on the ethical and clinical issues they experience. Then there's also at the med school, it's kind of a combination med school college program. There's what's called the Dartmouth TALES, T-A-L-E-S program, run by Dr. Robert Santulli. That pairs undergrads at Dartmouth and medical students at Dartmouth with a senior learning partner who has Alzheimer's disease, in order both to provide companionship and at the same time learn about how the disease is experienced by patients. The pediatrics department in the hospital regularly runs something called Schwartz rounds, where students and doctors come together to talk about difficult ethical choices that they're currently experiencing. Problems they had disclosing a medical error, the difficulty of giving a diagnosis to a patient who didn't want to hear it. I could go on, but the point I want to make is this. We don't have to accept the erosion of practical wisdom as inevitable. Right now, teachers across the country in the United States are involved in a political struggle to dismantle the destructive high-stakes testing and scripted curriculum and replace it with a core curriculum that encourages creative problem solving and integration. Veterans courts were created because of a political struggle by judges, vets, social workers, probation officers, local police to challenge the revolving door system of mandatory sentencing. And the central characters in all these stories are not app designers. They're wise institutional designers. They're citizen stateswomen and statesmen. And they're not saints or sages. They're people like us in this room. So, what about liberal arts colleges like Dartmouth? Ought they to teach virtue and practical wisdom? Actually, I don't think, although that's the common question, I actually don't think it's the right question. So I'm going to reframe it. Because I think the fact is that they do teach or undermine practical wisdom all the time. So the real question is, what are they currently doing and how could they do it better? I think students are learning or losing their good judgment in all their extracurricular and residential activities, not just at Dartmouth, at any college or university. A team, a sports team, can only play well if its members have the desire and skill to be loyal to each other, to understand each other, to be empathic, to be patient, to be responsible, to be resilient, to be brave. Right? Classic virtues or character traits that people like Aristotle and others have talked about. And they learn the ethical skills to be like this the same way they learn the skills of the sport. Through good coaches, mentors, good role models, and of course through falling down and picking themselves up again. Then there are all the communities that colleges like Dartmouth that form around religious fellowships, or around community service, or community outreach. There are the grand old-timers of my day, like the Tucker Foundation, and dozens of newcomers, like the Dartmouth Humanitarian Engineering Group. Then there are communities formed around arts and music and dance, around mathematics and medieval literature. So, are all communities places where good character and judgment are learned? No. Alas, it depends on what the purpose of the community is, how it's organized, and what the relationships are. All of you here know of the recent outcry over sexual assault and student hazing at some fraternities. This is part of an ongoing struggle over the nature of these communities, what they stand for, and what they teach their members. This was also an issue, alas, in my day 50 years ago. The public aim of these fraternities was brotherhood, the encouragement of friendship and fraternity. But often their practices were not aligned with their public aims. They tended to encourage friendships of usefulness and friendships of pleasure, not truly caring friendships. A central agenda was job seeking, helping the brothers make contact with the right people to get the right job after graduation. Often, the less benign and darker agenda was women seeking. Importing co-eds from Smith and Holyoke and Wellesley, plying them with alcohol and bedding them down in the pits in the basements of fraternity houses, fitted out with wall-to-wall mattresses. I have to tell you that I had a hard time being here, much of the time because of that. I had a really hard time seeing a movie like Animal House and appreciating it as a spoof. The dangers of such communities is not simply the mistreatment of women or the encouragement of binge drinking, it's also the corrosive effect on the internal souls of their members. Such communities teach feelings, habits, and ways of thinking that sap their human strengths, that impede students' abilities to flourish as colleagues and as friends in an academic community, and perhaps in their later lives too. But the fact that some communities can discourage judgment and good character in order to function does not take away from my central point that you don't learn practical wisdom by yourself. You learn it in relationships with others working on common projects. In the mid-1960s, there were communities here at Dartmouth where oddballs like me could find a home. Places like WDCR, the radio station, where experienced seniors, I remember one was David Shipler, who went on to be a great New York Times reporter and author, who people like David took the time and had the patience, a lot of patience, to mentor novices like me in the skill of editing news, of speaking clearly, of doing a 5-minute broadcast, of learning how to do interviews with the luminaries that came to campus. Or there was the education I got in the international dorm where I lived. It was a combination of 2 dorms, Cutter and North Hall. Half the students were internationals, half U.S. students. The aim of this community was to understand what was then called global affairs and U.S. foreign policy. Here I learned how to respect people I much disagreed with. I learned the skills of dialogue, the skills of good listening, the skills of tolerance. I was forced through trial and error to reflect on my ignorance and learn humility. Like one time I remember when a Dutch journalist came to speak. A Dutch journalist who dared, I thought, who dared to accuse the United States, my country, of secretly undermining and overthrowing the democratic Arbenz regime in Guatemala 10 years earlier. And I had the ignorance and hubris to stand up in public and tell him he didn't know what he was talking about. This is how you learn. But what about the formal classes and teaching that are at the heart of Dartmouth? Are moral development and practical wisdom simply absent from the central teaching mission of the college? What, after all, is practical? What, after all, is practical about the life of the mind in the ivory tower? It turns out, however, that being a good student and being a good teacher both demand practical wisdom. Students, for example, can't learn through trial and error without the courage to make a mistake. It takes courage for some students to talk up in class, to test out their ideas, to defend a difficult or unpopular idea. But if fear silences a student, the recklessness of those who talk all the time is as destructive to a class as it is to the talker. So courage in class demands learning the wisdom to balance cowardice and recklessness. So do other traits students need to learn. The empathy to understand those they disagree with, the fairness needed to consider conflicting ideas, the know-how and will to collaborate and to share credit. Without these traits of character and the practical wisdom to exercise such traits, students can't enjoy the life of the mind. They can't be good students. They can't be educated. So how are these habits and skills of practical wisdom learned at a place like Dartmouth? I would say they're learned the same way they're learned in professional schools. Not through packed lectures and multiple choice tests, not through MOOCs or PowerPoints. They're learned through mentoring and modeling and coaching. They're learned through creating safe learning communities inside our classrooms. What questions we ask in class teach students how to ask questions. How we pursue the dialogue with them models reflectiveness. They watch who we call on, and they watch who we don't call on. And in doing so, they learn about fairness. We teach them when and how to interrupt by when and how we interrupt. We teach them how to listen by how carefully we listen. If they hear us repeating what they said to clarify a point, they learn that it's okay to be uncertain if you don't understand something. If they see us admitting that we don't know something, we encourage intellectual honesty. And when we blow it, as we often do, we have the chance to model resilience and reflectiveness. And the students are always watching. They're always learning from what they see, from the lives we teachers lead, and from what we model. Our lives, as the great doctor and humanitarian Albert Schweitzer once said, are our arguments. What he actually said was, my life is my argument. And in many ways, we're teaching them at the same time they're teaching us, because they let us know, subtly or not so subtly, what they see. I want to close by underlining a critical trait each of us needs if we're going to learn to be wiser. Wisdom can only come from experience, but experience alone is not sufficient unless we're able to reflect on it. We can only learn from experience if we're mindful of what we're practicing. Without such reflective practice, we can just have experiences. We need to learn the habit of always asking ourselves, what did I learn from what just happened? We always want to get things right, but it's often when we get them wrong that the learning begins. At least if we prod and poke ourselves to figure out why we did what we did. So there's a paradox here. We need wisdom to avoid mistakes, but it's only the mistakes that teach us, if we're willing to reflect on them. Will Rogers put this memorably when he said, good judgment comes from experience, and most of that is the experience of bad judgment. The ancient Chinese scholar Gu Yanwu advised, to become wise, you must read 10,000 books and walk 10,000 miles. Well, most of you in this room are on your way to doing the first, and some of you are well into your long walk. May you find good friends and good mentors to accompany you. May you create good communities to nurture your soul so that you in turn can nurture these communities. And may you enjoy making some really good mistakes. Thank you.